Well, I'd like to add my welcome to you all, especially those who have travelled far to be here, whether it's just for this morning or for a few weeks. It is great to be surrounded by family and friends at this time. So this passage from Isaiah is quite a well-known passage. It's one that we often trot out at this time of the season as well. And I'm wondering, Peter, could you put the first slide of our Bible reading back up, just that opening paragraph of these words of Isaiah. And part of the background to this time, and when this was penned, if you like, the nation of Israel was going through a really difficult time and had lost its way, quite frankly. And so the words of the prophet that seem at this season to be so full of joy and good news to the least of these, if you like, was quite a strong challenge to them. It wasn't so much surrounded by good news of joy for all the people as we feel at Christmas time. We sort of impose that context on it. To them it was almost a little bit of a rebuke. So the prophet came saying these words, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good news to the poor." To preach good news to the poor. He sent me to build or to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom to the captives and release to those in darkness and for those in prison. Proclaim the year of the Lord's favour. Now, at Christmas time, we have this passage, but we, as I said, often overlay this message of joy that makes us feel like, oh, well, we've already done that. We're ticking all those boxes and we tend to feel good about ourselves. But there is that little catch in the back of our throat sometimes and we can relate so much to some of Cynthia's stories and the things that she shared earlier. When we're caught on the hop in a waiting room for an operation or for some test results and someone says, "Oh, isn't it great? Merry Christmas." We go, "Yeah, what's good about it?" No, I'm sure it wasn't quite like that, but we can be caught off guard and vent out all of our disappointments or our struggles, our tiredness, instead of the hope and the joy that should go along with this kind of a passage, this kind of an anointing on us. We are the ones anointed to preach good news to the poor. And it's easy to sort of, you could almost write that on a Christmas card, couldn't you? Good news to the poor. Woo-hoo, it's Christmas. But in our epistle for the day, the letter for the day, in Thessalonians chapter 5, it says, "Do not despise the words of prophets." And, we could apply that to today. Don't despise these words of Isaiah. And part of us wants to say, well, what is there to despise? This is just, goodness and light. This is Merry Christmas all wrapped up. It's a message of preferential care for the least of these, the lowliest people, those in most need. It fits so perfectly at Christmas time. And when Jesus read this passage, he said to the people who were listening that day, "These words have been fulfilled in me and in what I'm doing." That's exactly what my ministry is all about. Release to the captives and binding up the brokenhearted. Good news to the poorest. And everyone loved it. They thought that was great. They clapped and cheered and threw money. Until he started to talk about the specifics of who these people are, of these categories that he's mentioning. That's when people got upset. when he got specific about applying this passage to his very context there at that time. And the same sort of challenge was apparent to all those who heard it. When he talked about the wideness of God's mercy. And what about us? Do we want to sugarcoat this verse and write it in a card and send it off to friends? Or do we actually want it to come true? Do we actually want to be specific about who this is really for? Do we dare get specific and local about naming who those are that are the least? Pronouncing joy and good news has come. Could we be that bold? Sometimes the things in our hearts are at a disconnect with the joy of this season. You know, we talk about joy and love and everyone being merry and family so important and rah, rah, rah. And then we remember the relationships that are severed or strained. You know, those black sheep in the family who are awkward and difficult. I don't know how many of your families are trying to time visits. So, well, when are they going? We'll get there just after they've left so that we don't have to cross paths with those ones and in-laws or outlaws or whatever it might be. You know the difference between in-laws and outlaws. Outlaws are wanted. Sorry. These are my parents, so that's okay. They're not the in-laws. I'm offending the ones in Germany. We talk about the hidden addictions. Well, we don't really. We hide them. We pretend they're not there. Addictions to all sorts of things. Violence that's barely domesticated. The depression that gets denied. I was having a conversation with my neighbour just this week. He can't even use the word depression. He calls it the black dog that comes to visit. But he knows that I know what he's talking about. But we squash all of these things down, you know, in this season of joy and merriment, don't we? The affairs that go raging instead of the love. The self-loathing that cuts deep into the flesh of young and old. The greed and the hatred and the fear, instead of all of these good things that we keep talking about, that we're surrounded by in music and in words, in the shops and in our work and all around us. And sometimes we do feel like that we are somehow so disconnected from these words of joy and of hope that we feel we should be full of, yet sometimes we're not. Well, we could just push it down and pretend, or we could open it up and look at them and accept them and acknowledge them. You know, we could do the same on a slightly more global scale if we named those people who are the least, the people that we're proclaiming good news to. Is it good news to those who are refused a room at the inns of privilege, at our very doorsteps? Whether that's the elderly who are a bit too poor to afford good places to go to, or children that go without good health care. Maybe it's the refugees in their boats. Maybe it's those people who are homeless because they have schizophrenia, and somehow that puts them just out of the loop of all of the wonderful care that most of us enjoy. Is that their crime? Have we not been anointed to bring good news to all of those in our midst? Part of us resists this wideness of God's grace that Jesus pronounced was there for all, because that kind of grace changes things. It changes the world because it changes us. But that change is costly and painful. And then we get to the other slides. Peter, perhaps could we go to, I think it's 2 down. Nope, not that far, not that far. The God who can build up the ancient ruins is also the God who redeems the prodigal, who believes that he's completely made a mess of his own life. The God who can rise up the former devastations is also the God who raises a daughter's brokenness. The God who can repair the cities and devastations of many generations can repair even a nation that has lost its way in this world. Though it's an enormous task to be joy and hope in this world, to be good news to all of those people, the least of these, the difficult ones to love, the ones that are going to cost us if we really love them, that's an enormous task. To be joyful in every waiting room, every time someone catches us on the hop, to truly be joyful 24/7 is an enormous task. To bring hope, to be that little light all the time into this world. It's enormous. But we have hope because we know the one whose sandals we are unworthy to tie has gone before us. And he goes with us. We have hope because God redeems us. That same hope and joy that we're trying to spread to others and saying, it's there for you. The reality is, it's there for us when we are too limited, when our joy has run out, when our hope has left us and our strength is gone. The God who can rise up an entire nation is there for us and redeems our lives. That's where our hope lies. That's where our joy comes from. It's not in our own strength. It's not in some never-ending well of satisfaction and joy and peace and all those good things. It's in him. It's in Jesus Christ who came for us. So we have this funny kind of movement at work when we read this passage of Isaiah. We move from seeing that the joy and the hope that we proclaim to the least of these is a monumental task and we feel inadequate. But then we realise that that same joy and hope and the power of that redemption, the miraculous power that happens in small ways for small miracles. I was thinking that you were surrounded by small miracles here. That same power to turn lives around is there for us. And so it's then in that power, knowing that we are the redeemed, that we are the ones, the prodigals who've been transformed, whose lives have been taken from ruins to newness. And in those times of our own sadness and depression and weakness and all of those things, God's salvation is a garment that we put on and it covers us and it fills us. That's where our joy comes from. And then we have it to share. Advent, as I said over the last couple of weeks, is a bit of a time of the waiting. Because sometimes we can say, God is your hope, God is your joy, and it does come naturally from us. And that's fantastic. But even in those times when it doesn't just spring out of us naturally, we know that it is there for us. God's redemption and his salvation and his love is there for us every day, whether we quite feel it that day or not. And sometimes we find ourselves in that second category where we are waiting. We know it's there, but we're waiting and we light candles thinking, well, maybe it's today that garment feels not something just on the outside, but it is a well that gushes up within us, and that joy returns.